All right, let's get caught up with this Palestine shit real quick. Some news.
No matter how you slice it, we got a humanitarian crisis going on in Gaza. This has put our allies in the Five Eyes in a very precarious situation. At this point, there is an enormous amount of international pressure on them to condemn what Israel's doing. Canada, Australia, and the UK recognizing Palestine was a symbolic and political gesture that we need you guys to stop doing this bullshit. It's about sending a message to the Israelis that you can't keep doing this in our name and making us look bad. Okay, so let's talk about this real quick. All right, so what does this mean, right? As you guys know, Canada, the United Kingdom, and Australia have recognized Palestine as a state, right? What does this mean in the grand scheme of things? So let's kind of understand the gravity of the situation. Now, for many years, guys, as you guys know, many countries have recognized Palestine as a state, especially at the UN. So it's not new to recognize Palestine as a state. However, countries like Canada and the UK and Australia, who are close allies of the United States, recognize Palestine is significant.
Right.
Now, I'm going to talk about why it's significant one way, but then at the other hand, why it doesn't matter. Let's talk about why it's significant. It's significant because these countries, Canada, Australia, and the UK, are members of what's called the Five Eyes, okay? The Five Eyes, guys, is an alliance. Israel's in there as well. They just aren't formally in there. But the Five Eyes, guys, is all the first world English-speaking countries working together and sharing intelligence. US, UK, Australia, Canada, New Zealand, okay? That's the Five Eyes. And these countries obviously have very close partnership and they all speak English. The other thing you guys also need to understand is that Canada, the UK, Australia, and all these other countries kind of follow our foreign policy. So if we designate a country or organization as a terrorist organization, typically the Brits, the Australians, everybody else follow suit, okay? We are the leaders of not just the entire world, but we're also the leaders of the Five Eyes. So they follow all of our foreign policy. We go to war in Iraq, the UK, Canada, etc. follow us. All right? So for the UK, Australia, and Canada to deviate from our foreign policy is significant. Okay? That is significant. Because they historically have almost always followed what we do, for the most part. Right? There's some deviations here and there, but not something as big as this. All right? This is why it's significant. Because everyone's wondering, like, why is this such a big deal? That is why it's such a big deal. Now, let's talk about the actual, real back end of this and why it's happening. So, and Keir Starmer alluded to it earlier in his speech. When October 7th originally happened, right, the entire world was behind Israel. But as Israel began the conflict and continues the conflict almost 2 years later, we have seen a ridiculous amount of disproportionality when it comes to Israel's response to what happened on October 7th. Even if you believe the bullshit narrative that Israel put out with the mass 1,200 dead, Hamas is evil, all this other shit, right? If you believe
hella propaganda Israel kept putting out about some bullshit.
Even with the atrocity propaganda, it does not justify what Israel did in response. As of right now, of me making this video, we have roughly 62 to 63,000 dead in Gaza, okay? Maybe about 10 on the low end to 20,000 on the highest end are Hamas fighters. So that means that roughly 40,000 people that are innocent have been killed. On top of this, this does not account for the people that are missing, okay? Harvard estimates somewhere around 300 to 400,000 people are dead under the rubble, starvation, all this other stuff. We've seen testimony from doctors of the majority of their patients overwhelmingly being children and women. We know that when Israel invaded Gaza, there were roughly 2.3 million Palestinians living there, and over 50% of the population was children. Then we saw the story of Hen Rajab. We saw the starvation campaigns. We saw kids dying, etc. Right? So no matter how you slice it, we got a humanitarian crisis going on in Gaza. Now, this is very important to identify because this has put our allies in the Five Eyes in a very precarious situation. Either A, continue to follow us as we continue to lose more international support.
Right, because you
and
keep
look like
supporting
idiots
Israel.
and be on the wrong side of history, or make a line where they are acknowledging the victims, in this case, Palestine, and concede this one symbolic gesture to circumvent all the bullshit. Now, let me be explicitly clear about this. The United Kingdom, Canada, Australia, and all these other first world countries, their hands aren't clean either. They are countries that are run with strong lobbies, especially the United Kingdom. However, if you guys notice, these countries will not call what Israel's doing a genocide, especially the UK and Canada. But they're recognizing Palestine because at this point, there is an enormous amount of international pressure on them to condemn what Israel's doing, especially with the starvation. We know that you need roughly 500 trucks to come into Gaza every single day to feed the population. According to reputable sources, we know that maybe 10 to 20 trucks are coming in a day. So there's been a campaign of starvation on top of them being bombed. And Canada, Australia, and the UK recognizing Palestine was a symbolic and political gesture that we need you guys to stop doing this bullshit. Okay? It wasn't about doing anything real. It's about sending a message to the Israelis that you can't keep doing this in our name and making us look bad. But they kind of had 1 foot in, 1 foot out. Does that make sense? They still want to stand with Israel and the United States, but at the same time, they need to appeal to the international community and show that they're not fully on board with the genocide. So basically what Canada, Australia, and the UK are doing is, think of one leg in, one leg out, is what they're doing. Because them recognize a Palestinian state, that's not really that big of a deal. Right now, it's a big deal for them, but it's not a big deal in the grand scheme of things. Because unfortunately, as they discussed earlier in the news, there's nothing really viable going on to actually work towards a two-state solution. Now, let's talk about the two-state solution. All right? And this is where I was having this debate with Destiny. So a two-state solution, guys, is basically where
y'all didn't see that was a good debate.
The Palestinians get their own government.
I would say Myron cooked in that debate, but you choose who you choose.
Government, get their own airspace, get their own military, and are able to enjoy full sovereignty. Okay? The Israelis will not let this happen. And the reason why the Israelis will not let this happen is their argument is, if the Palestinians have their own sovereign state and have their own military, they are going to attack us. So allowing them to have their own sovereign state puts us in a position where our right to exist, we have an existential crisis. Now, the other problem here is that since they won't let them have their sovereignty, there's never going to be peace. But if they give them their sovereignty, there's a good chance that they might go to war and they might attack them with their own military, right? So this is why Israel occupies them, because they fear that they're going to be attacked. That's why the two-state solution isn't going to happen, because the Israelis will never let it happen, because the two-state solution requires the Palestinians to have their own government and their own military, which Israel looks at as a threat. Okay, Myron, what about a one-state solution? Well, the problem with the one-state solution is that like to call Israel the Jewish state. In order to be called the Jewish state, they must have the majority. This is why only 2 million Palestinians live in Israel. Meanwhile, 8 to 9 million are Jewish. They understand that if they brought in all these Palestinians from Gaza and from the West Bank, they would lose the majority. And if they lose the majority, what's going to happen is they are going to eventually vote in Palestinian leaders, and the Jewish state is slowly going to turn into a mixed state, and that's not what they want, because they understand that as soon as they don't have the majority, they are going to lose favor.
Right.
So this is why they also don't want to open up Israel to all the Palestinians. They're in a weird hypocritic stance here, because in their eyes, they say, look, we're the only democracy in the Middle East. But the funny part is that they're a democracy that also calls themselves the Jewish state. In order for them to be able to run the democracy that they want, they need to allow the Palestinians to come in and actually run a democracy.
Right.
But that is antithetical to them being the Jewish state. Do you see where I'm going with this, chat? This is why I always laugh when Zionists tell me that Israel is the only democratic state in the Middle East. That is a bold-faced lie for two main reasons. Number one, they're an apartheid state. What does that mean? That means that they have a different set of laws and rules and regulations for one group of people than another. Palestinians have no ability to vote or have any type of choice in their government that is occupying them, aka the Israelis. And then on the other end, they call themselves a Jewish state. In order for them to be a Jewish state, that means they must stay a Jewish majority, which is completely antithetical to the democracy process. So that is why I always laugh when Zionists say that they're a democracy. They are not. They couldn't be further from it. They are actually a colonial, apartheid, ethno-supremacy state. That is what they really are. Now, they don't like when people say this, but that is what they are. Actions speak louder than words. They can call themselves a democracy all they want, but I just gave you guys 2 pieces of why they're not. So on the two-state solution, they will never allow the Palestinians to have full sovereignty because they look at them as an existential threat. But on the one-state solution, they'll never give Palestinians full right of citizenship and rights as equal citizens, because that would make them no longer the Jewish state, which requires them to be the majority. See the problem that we have here? So Australia, Canada, and the UK recognize the Palestinian state. They know this. They know that a two-state solution is improbable, despite the fact that Keir Starmer mentioned it. And they know that a one-state solution would never fly with Netanyahu. So this was political theater to send a message to Israel that you need to stop starving these guys and making us look bad. That's what this is really about. 1 foot in, 1 foot out. Another dirty secret that a lot of people don't know is the Brits actually helped the Israelis bomb Qatar. Did you guys know that? The UK was heavily involved in helping refuel the fighter jets. Because, as you guys know, they had to use Jordanian airspace, maybe even some Syrian airspace, to get over to Qatar. And their jets don't have the ability to do that on their own. They're going to need a refueling to conduct that mission. Who will refuel them? The Brits. Now, obviously, this has been wiped from a lot of media sources, but the UK was actively involved in attacking Qatar. So once again, political theater. We're going to recognize the Palestinian state on one side, but we're also going to help you attack Hamas and a U.S. ally. That's where we are, chat. That is the two-state and the one-state solution, what they represent, and why getting either of them is fairly improbable, unfortunately, because the Israelis never wanted peace.
I remember watching that debate. Yeah, Myron did a pretty good debate on that. With Destiny, you know, Destiny talks fast. But it was a pretty good debate. I won't knock Destiny. It kind of sounded like he knew what he was talking about.